Tom Brown story, my Frankenstein, but I don't think I'll be able to do it. It's about 2 in the morning. My Frankenstein. I am lying on the dusty rubble of this man-made hell, trying to stop the blood flowing from my back. The gunshot wound only passed under the skin, entering from the center of my back by my belt line and traveling out my left side. Even though it entered my skin just atop my spine, I don't know, nor do I care to know, how it missed crippling me. It's all a blur of surreal images that are compounded by sheer exhaustion and pain. I am at a point where I can no longer think clearly. My only concern is that I stop bleeding and regain my strength. Yet part of my immediate concern is also for the man lying not far from me. Ironically, I am not so much worried about his well-being as much as I hope that he does not get up. The landscape around me is a dusty heap of broken down buildings, old pipes, and rusted hulks of nondescript machinery and debris. Not only is this a foreign land, but a foreign land in surreal landscape, born more of a nightmare than of an industrial vision. This corrupt decay is slowly being reclaimed by nature's forces. Clumps of saplings and assorted brush are overtaking much of the area. Grasses are growing from the cracks and crevices of buildings. Everywhere, etched in the concrete dust, are the tracks of animals, of life, and of hope. For me, this reclamation of nature over man is a welcome vision, a much-needed relief for the hideous stress I faced for the past few days. The trembling in my body from both fatigue and shock is slowly ebbing. Bit by bit, awareness returns to my mind. The inside of my head feels as dusty and swirling as the concrete dust devils that dance down the catacombs and recesses of these old buildings. The man lying by me has not moved. Time seems to be frozen. Place no longer really has any sense of reality or context. It takes what seems like a torturous eternity to reach out and pick up the 38 police special lying not far from me. The bleeding begins again as I grasp the barrel and bring it toward me. It's obvious now that I can't move and I won't be leaving this area until my bleeding completely stops. Slowly, I am realizing that I am thirsty, very thirsty. Hunger is only a distant dream, for the thirst must be satisfied before my hunger returns. Dehydration, my old friend, how well I know you. I think my mind swoons with the thought of finding any water soon in this horrid place. Even if there was any water here, it would be rancid and putrefied with chemical and biological waste. Yet it is not the water that concerns me, nor this dusty place. After all, I face far harsher conditions in my life. I know that I can do what needs to be done to survive. But now I am also concerned about getting the man who is lying beside me out. If it were only me there, would be no problem. I have no idea how badly he's hurt, nor do I really care. To complicate the situation further, beyond regaining my senses, stopping the bleeding, and resting up to face the long journey ahead, I really don't have any idea how far it is to a known civilization. Basically, I only have a vague idea where I am. Again, if I were on my own and healthy, I would not care where I was. Any wilderness is home, and normally I would avoid civilization. Now I have no choice. I have to get some inhabited area as quickly as I can, not so much for my sake, but for the man near me. I know the likes of this arid rocky desert land very well. I know that I can easily kill, even skilled wanderers, and I both love and respect its power. Yet now the conditions are such that any mistake could cost me my life. All I can do at the moment is to gaze motionless upon the distant horizon and watch the approach of an oncoming late-day windstorm. It's little consolation that both of us are lying in a protected area. But then again, I would not dare move very far, even if I wasn't. I cannot risk more bleeding, especially in my condition. Torment and thought and dehydration have taken a heavy toll. The mind cannot be trusted in this state. Mistakes are also too easy to make and clear. Thought is well beyond my grasp at this point of space and time. I now feel myself slipping into the place somewhere between dream and reality, nightmare and vision. The oncoming storm both fascinates and distracts me from my prison of flesh. The exhaustion finally and fully catches up with me as I slip in and out of sleep, much needed, beautiful sleep, only to be awakened abruptly, heart pounding with the frightening thought of letting down my guard. I struggle to stay awake, gazing at the storm and feeling the initial dry gusts of wind that blow the dusty concrete into my nose and lungs. These searing dry gusts, like opening a hot oven, further dry my blood to a thick crust. With an equal mix of blood and powdered concrete, this powdered concrete mix, now so thoroughly embedded in my wounds, is an appreciated gift of styptic medicinal quality. I think how odd it is that I hadn't noticed it before the coagulating effects of the cement dust gift. But at this point, everything is a gift. Just to be alive is a gift, no matter what struggles lay ahead. I cautiously shift my position so that I could see both the approaching storm and a man beside me. I also firmly grasp the gun in my left hand, which feels very strange. Held even my dominant right hand, any firearm feels foreign. And never part of myself, even though I can shoot any weapon with the best of them. I despise firearms, for it is the bullet and not the hunter that does the killing. Usually, at long distances, in this world, it takes no skill to kill with a firearm. In my world, grandfather's world, an honorable hunt would be at very close range with a primitive weapon. Right now, I am glad to have the gun. It would be impossible for me to use my primitive weapon now, for I just do not have the strength. I begin to fight the demon of sleep with thoughts of weapons and hunting. A gun is a great equalizer, I think. The hunter no longer needs to be able to track or stalk to kill. Even the most blundering hunters can bag game with a firearm. Some are so proud that they can drop a deer at several hundred yards, deluding themselves and others into believing that they are great hunters. Little do they know that they are not hunters at all, just good shots. Grandfather would say that there was no honor in that kind of hunt. I could hear the words of grandfather so clearly in my mind. An honorable hunt, grandson, is when the arrow strikes its mark. The fletches should just be passing the bow hand. That kind of hunt is honorable, for it demands stealth, cunning, and movement like a shadow upon the land. It is these thoughts of the gun and hunting that now, especially in the light of all that has happened, have become so poignant and powerful to me. I am suddenly beginning to understand the hunt is very strange and new way, a way that has made me realize two ways of life, two worlds of the ancient and the technical have collided. As a result, I have been shot in the back and a man lies several feet away, unconscious. It's all beginning to make sense now, grandfather once said. As a hunter, you also must always move, observe, and see as the hunted, for then and only then can you become both. I understand now what had been my mistake. I had remained the hunter, thus leading to this carnage. It was only in that split second before the gun was fired that all I became both. I became one and saved my own life. Still fiercely fighting sleep, I glance over at the crumpled heap of a man who had once been my student and a brother. His real name is Mike, but to all of his covert op friends, he was known as Nails. Yes, tough as nails, or so, and everyone else thought. He is the arrogant sort of know-it-all that dares you to teach him anything. But teach him I did, and he became my creation, my Frankenstein monster. Yet I couldn't blame myself entirely, for all I did was to teach him the lethal skills of the scout. It was he who went over the edge, he who made all of the wrong choices, and only he who chose to kill and kill again, both legally and now illegally. He chose to walk that path, a path from which few can return with any sanity, far less any humanness or compassion. He became what he lived, a warrior, a soldier of fortune, and an assassin. He was lethal, and death consumed him. As I lay here watching the storm, I still blame myself for being part of his creation, his madness, and his deadly choices. Basically, I gave him the tools to become a more efficient killer. I taught him to track, to survive with nothing, to stalk, and to move in and out of any environment without being observed. I taught him to escape, evade, counter, track, avoid tripwires, all with no backup or equipment. Most of all, I taught him the Apache Wolverine fighting techniques, which make a man more animal than human. What was lost in the translation was the honor of the scout, the warrior's creed, where the warrior is always the last to pick up the lance. He chose instead to pick up the lance first, and he lived as the lance. Yes, I helped create this monster. With skills as lethal as mine, tracking him was almost as difficult as it would be to track myself. I wonder why I didn't see the signs of trouble years before when I first met him. Possibly, if I had seen the hideous demon that lived within him, I would have taught him differently or not at all. I began to think back over all the events that led up to this moment, trying to determine where I went wrong with my teaching and why I missed that demon within him. I slip into a state of mind someplace between remembering and reliving, recalling vividly the first time he and I met. As I travel in and out of pain and fatigue, exhaustion, thirst, and the power of the oncoming storm and night, I can clearly see our first meeting, hear our first conversation, shadowy echoes of the past slowly come into focus as memory slips into the reality of reliving the events that took place so many years ago. Our first meeting was in a crowded Quonset hut, located deep in the heart of an obscure military base back during the dark days of the Cold War. It was an odd assortment of people gathered there, some covert military groups from the United States, some from other countries, some other individuals with affiliations no doubt with the CIA, and God knows how many other secretive spooks attended that fateful class. The group had been put together by two of my friends, covert military elite types I had taught many times before. I was quite young at the time, especially to be teaching these battle-hardened and seasoned vets. But even though I was young and I had made a name for myself teaching and tracking for these higher circles of covert operations groups, I was well respected both here and abroad for my skill as a tracker and my ability to teach. The problem now was that the guys in the Quonset hut did not know me, but they did know and respect my two military friends, Chuck and Mark. It was obvious, especially after being introduced to the class, that these men had no respect for me or my skills. Most of them were ordered to take the class and really didn't want to attend. I was probably 10 years younger than the youngest of men. I was about to train, and that further drove a wedge between us. As I began to address the class, the men would not quiet down. They played grab ass, talked in small groups, and some had their backs turned to me. Even as I raised my voice, I could not get their attention. It was obvious to me that this would be a tough group unless I can get their attention. Finally, Chuck, my old and respected military friend, stepped in and commanded the group to come to attention. Like magic, the room quieted, and the men turned to attention. Obviously, not wanting to piss off Chuck, Chuck said, "Listen to the tracker. His skills will save your life." With that, room fell into a painful silence, and I approached the podium again to speak. As I began to address the men, I could feel the disrespect oozing from them, especially from one guy in the back of the room who was snickering under his breath as I spoke. The more I spoke, the more he snickered, and I could clearly see his actions and body language, that he was full of himself. My eyes met his, and he glared back at me with a look that could kill. It was obvious that he was respected by the other men, a sort of ringleader, and the men would do what he wanted. I knew that he was going to be trouble. In fact, I knew that the group would be trouble unless I could immediately gain their attention and ultimately their respect. As the commotion in the room began to increase again, I looked over at Chuck and he winked at me. Instantly, I knew that he wanted me to do what I always do when faced with situations of disrespect. I earned that respect by showing them what they don't know. Without giving it a second thought, I bellowed out to the class saying, "I want you all to hunt me." A stunned silence fell over the room and the men looked dumbfounded. The ringleader, Mike, asked sarcastically, "What do you mean, hunt you?" Those were the first sarcastic words I ever heard Mike say to me, and that began our first meeting. I said again, "I want you to hunt me. Find me, all of you, at once, and bring me back here." Another man named Shin asked me what the rules were and laid them down confidently. I told them that I was going out into the triangle, which was a 5-acre thicket of woods surrounded by 3 paved roads. I then asked them to give me only a 5-minute head start, but with one rule. I told them if they felt tapped on the back of the head with a small stick, they would immediately return to the hut without saying a word. They all agreed, laughing wildly as I left the hut. I could hear the 34 men charging the forest triangle, whooping and laughing, cracking jokes about how easy this would be. I could clearly hear one guy say, "One guy against all of us without camouflage? This is almost too easy." They ran into the forest with the same kind of charge that I expected them to. They searched forever, but couldn't find me, and one by one, sometimes 2 by 2, they returned to the hut, their attitude now sullen. It was beginning to dawn on them that in the war they would have been dead. It was also obvious to them that they were not as good as they thought they were. They looked hard, but none of them ever saw me, not even after being touched or hit by the stick. I decided to leave Mike for the last and torment him out of the triangle by touching him with sticks every time he turned around, but he never saw me. He just grew more and more enraged with each passing touch. As I thought back to that game, I realized that this was the point at which the first seed of revenge was planted in Nails. I knew from the start that he was the instigator and ringleader of the whole bunch, so I purposely designed my tactics so that men right around him would be eliminated from the game, right from under his nose. My first order of business, as always, was to camouflage myself to perfectly fit the landscape using the mud, clay, dirt, and soil of the land. This camouflage is so precise and so unlike the military camouflage the men are using to seeing that it renders the wearer virtually invisible. Coupled with my ability to move in ways that are out of context with the expected human movement, no one could find me, even though in most instances I was only inches from them. I would blend with the brush, become a stump, hide in trees, or lie in the muck along the stream beds and ponds. Each time a man would pass, I would gently reach out and tap him on the head or shoulder with a stick. He would whip around, trying to see me, but I would just quickly and deftly disappear. I was using the ancient scout methods of escape, invisibility, and camouflage that was so foreign to modern approaches, and the game, as always, was in my favor. For effect, the second-to-last man I took out was following Nails across a small log that spanned a mud hole. Little did he realize that I had become part of the log, and as soon as he stepped on me, I pulled him deep into the mud. Nails turned around quickly, only to find that his friend was nowhere in sight. I could see then, at that very moment, the thirst for revenge deeply embedded in Nails' eyes. This game I play with any cocky or arrogant warriors is something I have been doing to gain respect for many years. It was not my invention. The credit must go to grandfather, for he would give me hunt many times in this way. Actually, the process of the game is so simple that it should be illegal. Simple for the hunted, that is. Grandfather will often say the hunted always has the advantage. Given the skills, cunning movement, and invisibility taught by the Apache Scout training, no one can find me. To the hunters, the searchers, it is as if I've disappeared off the face of the earth. It is only when they blunder right by me that I touch them with the stick, and even then, they rarely see me when they spin around to look. This process of elimination easily freaks out their minds and crumbles their arrogant confidence. Basically, they learn what they don't know and fully understand how vulnerable they have been. It also becomes obvious to them that they are not part of the wilderness, just passing through it like aliens. I walk back into the Quonset hut to a captive audience. Sitting in stunned silence, no doubt I now had their rapt attention, because I had gained their respect and more. Chuck turned to me and said flatly, Were you tired, Tom? It took you 30 minutes to throw this bunch out of the woods? That's nowhere near your record. Oh, I know, you were just toying with someone. With that remark, I saw Mike's face flush and disappear into his hands. It was obvious that he was really humbled, but also shaking with a barely controlled rage. I also knew that this rage inside him was directed right at me. Yet ironically, so was his respect. He didn't give me trouble for the rest of the class, but he didn't talk to me either. I explained to the men that this class had everything to do with what had happened in the triangle and all of the mistakes that they made. I told them that if I had taken a knife and they had guns, and this was a real war, they would all have been slaughtered. After all, they all admitted that they had never once even caught a glimpse of me. And when you can't see someone, you can't shoot to kill. From these opening words, I moved the class through a week of counter-tracking, escape, evasion, survival, camouflage, and invisibility. I taught them to move like shadows. Slowly but surely, as the week progressed, they began to become more silent and cunning. I made many friends, and during the breaks, I would teach some of the men how to make an arrowhead or use a bow. Some learned to make fires with hand drills and even create baskets in the end. They all loved the class. All, that is, except Mike. I just couldn't tell what he wanted. I did admire his drive and passion for learning. However, it was far surpassed normal learning and bordered an obsession. On the final day, Mike came up to me and gave me a broad smile. He thanked me and apologized, yet I could still feel a deeply set anger toward me, as if he wanted to test me. I didn't trust him, for there was something strange hidden in his eyes that I did not like. Finally, all the students had pulled out, and I was left in the hut with Chuck. After a short planning session for the next class, I watched Chuck drive away. It was then that I felt the tug of inner vision, a sense of danger from above. Without turning around to look, I simply said, "Come on down here, Mike. You'll slip off and bust your ass." When I heard his feet hit the ground, I turned to him and smiled, dumbfounded. He looked at me and said, "How did you know I was up there?" I answered by saying, "There are far greater powers of awareness that you cannot yet grasp, and that you will take time." Mike asked, "Will you teach me when you're ready?" I said. I watched him walk away into the night, dazed and confused, and a bit angry, as he wondered how the hell I'd known he had been on top of the hut. I watched him disappear, and then I disappeared, wondering if and when I would ever see Mike again. Months passed without my hearing much of anything from any of the men I had trained. That is not odd, especially since these men were probably heavily involved in Vietnam, and not in the usual way. These men were covert operatives, and my security clearance at this time was on a need-to-know basis at best. I would receive a cryptic note or letter, unsigned except for a nickname, and usually with a strange postmark once in a while. I would get a strange phone message that my folks would receive, but usually these were as odd as the notes and letters. It was obvious for these fragments or correspondence that the theaters of operation were not only Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, but also included other hot spots throughout the world. I don't know why so many of the men kept in loose contact with me. The only thing I could figure is that they appreciated the skills I had taught them. In a way, these notes, letters, and phone calls were like an intricate tracking case. I love mysteries, no matter how the tracks arrive or where they take me. Often I would piece together reports I had read in the newspapers or heard on the radio and wonder if one of my students was involved in these hotspots I was learning about. The ones that concerned me the most were the suspicious deaths or disasters that would happen throughout the world. Many of these suspicious incidents, especially where very covert operations had been used, seemed eerily similar to the methods I used when teaching the men. Yet the most disturbing by far were the messages that I know came from nails. These were not as cryptic as the rest, nearly always contained bragging, and were sometimes even threatening to me in a veiled sort of way. It was as if the student were testing the master. Over the years, these letters diminished in frequency, but they remained frightening. I could clearly see that Nails was crossing the line toward insanity. It seemed that he could not separate reality from nightmare, and began to live a strange existence. During the few quick, intensive training classes I later held, he tended to avoid me. When the subject of his letters or what he was doing surfaced, he withdrew into himself and gave me an evasive answer, sometimes no answer at all. He would completely ignore the question altogether, like it was never asked. It was also during these training sessions that I noticed the classic and hard look in his eyes. His humanness seemed to be fading and was being slowly replaced by an animal or demon. Many years after our last training session together, I finally heard that Nails had been discharged. The guys who knew him didn't say much at all about him, just that he had quit years earlier and gone off on his own. They alluded to the idea that he was talking and taking contracts on his own, a soldier of fortune, but they really couldn't be sure. They did say that he was not the same man they once known or knew. He had changed, became more violent, and spent vast amounts of time alone. He had withdrawn completely from everyone, even from what he once was as a man. In fact, based on the tone of his one-time friends, no one wanted to be around him anymore. Hearing this news was sad, yet it is exactly what I had expected. His notes, actions, and especially his eyes spoke of a man who was lost unto the world and himself in some horrid nightmare. It was nearly a year after I learned that Nails was gone, figuratively and literally, that I received a strange call from someone claiming to be from a foreign land and loosely associated with the State Department. The caller only gave his first name and told me that he had worked with me twice before, both training and on tracking cases. I groped to the voice with the face, but I could not come up with any tangible connection, in fact. When I asked him a few questions about our training, he had all the wrong answers. It was obvious that he had never been one of my students. The only thing I could say for sure was that he must have known or been around during one of my tracking cases. He did not know He did know a little, but not much. As near as I can guess, he may have been around people I trained and picked up what little he knew from their conversations. I was very skeptical at best and didn't really trust him or what he was telling me. His call was short, both in duration and instructions. All he said was that Nails was on the run and I was responsible for him. He said that Nails had killed several people and now they needed me to track him down. It was obvious that he wanted to keep this quiet, for he only gave me a place and time to meet a man named Frank. Before I could even think of asking any questions, he hung up, which was typical for these types of tracking cases. 3 things bother me about this tracking case. First, I was not officially asked into the case. Second, I did not know this man Frank, and at best, I had to travel very far to get to him. And third, I would be tracking one of my own. Tracking one of my own was a very lethal endeavor, and one I was not looking forward to, even if I did decide to go and track. It was also cryptic. It was obvious that they wanted to sweep Nails under the carpet, and that made me very angry. It's bad enough they put all of this training and time into a person, use them up, and then abandon them when they are no longer useful or go too far, never offering any help. They, the governments of the world, throw them away when they no longer fit their purpose. Nails had clearly stepped across the line, or at least that was what I was led to believe. I searched the papers, foreign and domestic, for recent killings, but found nothing similar to what the caller had told me. Either it was someone who wanted me to do another tracking altogether under the Veil of Nails name, or what he was telling me was true. I ruminated for days, far too long to be able to hitchhike to the site where I was supposed to meet this Frank. As usual, I waited until I was pushed to the limits of time and destination until I made a decision. It was all too odd, all too impossible that this anonymous caller could have known of Nails and hit a soft spot in my soul. As usual, when under time and destination constraints, I begged my folks for airfare, and as usual, they wondered what tracking case I was going to get myself into. After all, to my folks, the only tracking cases I took where I needed airfare were the ones that no one wanted me near: government, FBI, police, or family sanctioned. It was those unauthorized cases that usually got me into the most trouble my folks would have to bail me out of in the final analysis. Yet those same illegal and sketchy cases were exactly the kind of tracking challenges I loved so much. Those brought out the scout in me, the warrior, and I loved them with a passion. I could not help but take the challenge of this mystery, especially where Nails was involved. Someone knew how to bait me. My flight went well, but getting into a foreign country was a little more difficult than I expected. I should have not been surrounded or surprised at this, though, because back then I traveled light and I was far from the fashion statement. In fact, with my long hair and beard, well-worn clothes, and even more worn moccasins, it was no wonder I had so much trouble passing customs. I'm surprised I was able to get into the country at all. The trip from the small airstrip to the ancient hotel was meant much more quickly than I'd expected. Thanks to a good-natured old man in an ox cart, the hotel was a sleazy dump, and my room was nothing more than a cot. A dresser that had only one drawer, a stained mirror, a bare light bulb. The bathroom was communal, shared with other derelicts that lived in the hotel. I fit right in with the wild crowd. This man Frank did not show up at the appointed time, nor even on the right day of the week. Given the ambience of the little town, I don't think they adhered to any set schedule or time. If Frank lived there, he probably wouldn't have noticed that he was horribly late. I began to wonder if the whole thing were a hoax, or possibly Frank was watching me in order to assess my intentions. Possibly he was making sure that I was alone and had not alerted anyone to my whereabouts. Just as I was about to give up and head home, Frank showed up. If ever there was a man who stood out in a place, it was Frank. He was impeccably dressed in a regulation summer suit and tie, just slightly loosened around his neck. He arrived in a black Suburban that was driven by another man, who never spoke or got out of the SUV. By the looks of the dust and grit and the Suburban, they had driven quite a distance, and neither looked thrilled to be there. He didn't have to introduce himself, and he knew exactly who I was. There was no doubt that he had done his homework and had several photos of me. He was that sure of himself. Come to think of it, in the business he is in, that could have been a costly mistake on his part. I wonder how he stayed alive so long. Like Frank, our introduction and conversation was short, contemptuous, and direct. He simply said, "Mr. Brown, I'm Frank. Get into the car and I'll brief you." Without hesitating, I ran back to the hotel room, gathered my scant belongings, and checked out. I doubted that I would be coming back into the hotel any time soon. As I approached the Suburban, I noticed Frank's walk, and it was obvious he was carrying a large handgun. Definitely not regulation. I also began to grow concerned that they were going to off me because of some forgotten sin I had committed. We drove a long way in absolute silence. The silent driver kept glancing in the rearview mirror, both to look at me and to keep an eye out for anyone following us. It became clear that they were not supposed to be involved in this situation. The gravel road soon gave way to a rutted desert road, and then no road at all. At best, we were traveling on an ox cart path across barren, harsh, and very dry landscapes. I could see the tortured mesas and plateaus in the distance, and to the distance were where we were headed. I began to grow concerned because I had little water with me. Normally, when on a tracking case, I could easily survive and find water even on this barren land. But I would be tracking, and enough time to gather water and survive would be difficult to find. I could see a very small and broken down shack or house in the distance, and we appeared to be headed right toward it. As we drew closer, Frank finally spoke, but again with a conversation of words and a certain evasiveness. He told me that this was the last known place Nails had been. Nails had killed a young mother and child, holing up in this shack for several days. On the last day there, he killed a returning farmer and fled into the mountains. The bodies had been ritualistically mutilated, and the blood was used to write cryptic mottos and drawings on the walls. Because the bodies were not found for a week, and given the conditions, the authorities could not be sure if there was cannibalism involved, or if animals had eaten part of the bodies. Frank and I stepped out of the Suburban and into a hot cloud of dust. There is a place inside of myself that I call the tracker point of view. It is where everything is enhanced. Sound is magnified. Tracks become windows not only to the past, but to the soul. And all senses are at the highest level of alert. Such was the level when I passed the front gate and immediately noticed Nail's footprint. Footprints to me are like portraits to the most people. A footprint is an identifying as a fingerprint. But unlike a dead fingerprint, a footprint reveals everything about its maker. There was no doubt in my mind that nails had been there, and judging from the deterioration of the track, he had been there 9 days ago. I knew that I had my work cut out for me because nails had a long head start. Frank accompanied, I can't even say the word. Frank accompanied me into the house. Here my senses screamed for. I could still see the carnage splattered upon the walls. The writing and the stench of rotted death still hung heavy in the air. The air was thick with the buzz of flies, searching for small bits of carrion or alighting on the bloody walls. Here and there were written military mottos, intermingled with insane scrawlings, lacking in context or any sensible definition. Then, out of all the writings, one caught my eye, and I was dazed, no shocked. Written in charcoal was the old Apache scout teaching, the hunted always has the advantage. And I knew that Nails was using this to taunt me into finding him, hunting him. Frank looked at me and said, "You see why we called you. He is one of yours, and now you have to find him and bring him to me and only me." This statement and request really pissed me off. They assumed that I created this demon and that I had to clean it up for them, as if I were responsible for creating this mess and they were without sin. That was so much crap, and I told him so. Frank was clearly upset at my anger. He said, "We didn't really want to call you in, but we lost him and his trail several days ago. We called off the search because everyone except some of us thinks he is dead." With that, Frank pulled a gun and a flare from his back and handed them to me. He told me that Nails was definitely armed and I would definitely need a gun. I declined the offer because I never carry a weapon. A weapon to me becomes a liability. He asked me to take the flare and to torch it off if I found Nails. He'd be watching for it and come take us out. I looked at the flare incredulously, and Frank simply said, "We have our ways of locating you and that flare." It sounded like a load of crap to me, and I wondered again if I was being set up. Upon returning to the SUV, Frank gave me a large jug of water, and without as much as a goodbye, got into the truck and took off. I watched them disappear in a cloud of dust. Seemed glad to be away from this hell. On another hand, I was right in the middle of the world and about to track someone who would be a challenge, especially if he remembered anything I taught him. As dusk fast approached, I made a camp well outside the home site. There was no way I wanted to stay in the cruel shack surrounded by all the insanity written on its walls. No, I felt safer with the snakes, scorpions, and spiders, and I really hate any kind of building anyway. At least being outside, I could feel and hear the concentric rings of anyone approaching, which was not so within the shack. I headed out before first light, following no track in particular, but heading outside of the search area, I knew that if it were find any clear tracks belonging to Nails, they would have to be well outside the areas that were heavily searched. I instinctively knew that I was headed in the right general direction because that would be the choice Nails had made. From what I taught him, he would have gone in the direction that the searchers would least expect. It was also one of those two routes where he could throw off tracking dogs and stay out of sight of searchers on foot, horseback, and from the air. His route into the rugged landscape would also afford better survival conditions for a man on the run. All the while, my senses were at high alert. I watched and listened with such intensity that by noon my head spun with overload. I had to be careful that he was not hunting me, not watching me, not circling in for the kill. As I pushed far outside the search area, a horrible, haunting thought occurred to me. I wondered if Nails were not playing some sort of deadly chess game. He would know that I would think and possibly do the opposite. He was not a stupid man. A stupid man would not have lived this long in his profession. No, Nails was far from stupid and probably one of the best warriors I have ever known. If he followed what I taught him, he would lay down false trails, backtrack, or make moves in counter-tracking that would eat up a lot of the tracker's time that I could not afford, at least not in these conditions or under these circumstances. Any mistake could prove deadly, so I could chance nothing. I had to think like him, and as a tracker, I had to become him. Otherwise, I would lose this contest, this ancient game of life and death, hunter and hunted. By nightfall, I was well outside of the search area, but had not found any of Nail's tracks. I had no choice but to bed down in the more of a hide than any type of shelter. I had to sleep so that I could not easily be found, and well forewarned of any approaching danger by the disrupted sounds of the night. I might just well as have stayed awake the entire night, such was my tormented sleep. Every odd sound or lack of sound brought me to rapt attention. My heart would race with the adrenaline as I searched the night, trying to figure out what had awoken me. In that place between sleep and reality, I felt something's presence, something watching me, more through inner vision, a sense of knowing than from any outside clues. The whole night made me uneasy, and fatigue was a place I didn't want to be. Fatigue could easily compound problems in my thinking and movements, causing me to become sloppy or let down my guard. Long before first light, I began to push on, playing the ever-intensifying chess game with my thoughts and choices. I did not find Nail's first track until well after sunrise, and it was a tremendous relief. I had been right to follow my inner vision and my instincts. It was obvious that Nails was not playing around or playing any game, but sticking to the same instincts that had driven me. Now that I had a clear trail, I had to be very careful of what lay ahead. I did not want to be lulled into a false sense of security, thinking that Nails would always be following my teaching. I could not be certain if and when he would change tactics and begin the counter game. I also could not allow my concentric rings to give away my position. If Nails was within the tracker point of view, I would be difficult to track and would approach him without him knowing many miles and even days in advance. I don't know what caught my eye or why it caught my eye. It was a combination of a stray sign of a glint and the feeling that something was out of place. I was on his trail, but the trail refused to give away its secret. It was only after seeing that which was out of context with the land that I realized Nails had circled around far ahead and set a tripwire trap. It was a hook type and very hard to spot at best. Upon closer inspection, I realized the trap would not have harmed me. It would have set off a small landslide and caused tremendous concentric rings, a vast ripple through the desert that would have alerted Nails to my approach. Upon finding a trap, a deeper struggle began to emerge inside of me, a more intense set of questions and rules for this chess game. Did Nails set the trap for anyone or just for me? I began to believe that it was a set for me. Such was the perfect way it was camouflaged. He would not have needed that kind of set for just any searcher. This was definitely designed with the hunter, the tracker in mind. At this point, my pace had been cut in half. I could not decide whether to abandon his tracks or take a more instinctful or instinctual route to where I felt he might be. Taking the instinctual route would be far safer, but I could not be sure that I was headed toward him. I needed hard evidence, a track or concentric rings of nature, to make sure I was still on his trail. If I did parallel his tracks, I would have cut back and occasionally to verify that I was going in the right direction. But this would waste time. The problem was, if I stayed on his trail, I would have to set my pace to crawl, just in case he had set more tripwires or traps. Every decision was a difficult one. Every move had to be thought out, and every step carefully taken. I also could not assume that all he had was a handgun. That is what Frank had told me. They assumed that because family had been killed by a .38, that's all he had. I assumed nothing after all. He could have a high-powered rifle with him that would be capable of dropping me at a great distance. One of the most difficult tracking situations is when I am tracking a man with sniper capabilities. As a tracker, your attention is divided between the close focus world of the track and everything between that track and eternity. This sniper capability augmented my potential traps and nails ability as a scout, upped the intensity and stress factor to its highest and most exhausting limits. It was bad enough to face this tortured landscape even without having a track, but given all of the other variables, the mind, emotion, and spirit, as well as the body, become horribly beaten by this level of stress. With the sniper capability in mind, I decided to stay far outside the trail and cut back in for confirmation, only when necessary. This decision would help me avoid the potential of sniper fire and avoid any traps that he might have laid down. This decision proved to be the best for my pace quickening, enabling me to move as fast as or faster than nails. For a tracker, it was important to move faster than what is being tracked. Otherwise, I would never have a chance of catching up. It became obvious throughout the day that I had made the right decision. Upon cutting back into his track, I found 3 more traps with no doubt now that they were designed for me. 2 of the traps were designed as early warning systems, but the 3rd trap was potentially lethal. It was obvious that Nails wanted me dead, or at the least given the potentially lethal qualities of the trap, that he didn't care. Yet, even though I was now moving as fast as or faster than he, I was still far behind. I had to formulate another plan of action. I knew that I had to make another radical decision that would take me deeper into the mind of Nails, a place I didn't really want to go. By the 6th day, I emerged from the rugged mountainous landscape and gazed down upon a huge valley. I could clearly see that it was drier than these tortured rocky peaks and nearly devoid of water. Up to this point, finding water in seeps and dried streams had not been a problem, but I knew that it would take me at least 2 or more days to cross the valley. Water would now be impossible to find. Looking across the valley to distant hills and mountains, a horrible realization came over me. Nails could be watching the valley, and his vantage point would provide him with a clear shot of me. This valley forced me to make that radical decision I dreaded. I had to abandon my method and fully become Nails. I would have to use all of my skill to cross the valley and find him, now more of my instinct than ever before. I could feel him out there, hiding like a lethal hunted animal. I could enter his distorted mind and thoughts to a place so dark it made me sick. With the setting of the torturous sun, I began to sense where he had gone and where he might be hiding. It was part guess, part instinct and part knowing the forces that were driving his mind. And I somehow knew what decisions he made. At full dark, I left my hide and began to cross the valley. Far outside his route of travel and trail, my movement led me far away from where I had last encountered his track. And now there was no way I could dare return to his track or trail. I was relying totally on thinking like him, acting like him, and becoming him. The place inside of me was as dark and tormented as the valley I crossed. The darkness, however, also became my friend, for I was able to cover vast distances quickly. By first light, I had crossed the valley, cutting a full day of my tracking with far less stress. I slept as best I could for much of the day, holed up in a little dry cave that was blessedly cool and well away from the sun. My sleep was tormented and sporadic. I awoke frequently from hideous nightmares, feeling more haunted or hunted than hunter in the deepest recesses of my mind. I become Nails, for he no doubt would be having the same kind of tormented sleep. I wondered if he even knew that I was on his trail, or for that matter, if he knew that I knew about his killings. After all, I had not made my mistakes that I knew of, yet a nagging feeling from the deep inside of me intensified the life or death chess game. I wondered if he was playing the same game by entering my mind and thinking like me. I also wondered if he sensed my intentions, my decisions, and anticipated my radical approach to the nightmare. I was fairly confident that I had made the right decision because of its radical nature, but the feeling still persisted that he might know of my out-of-context approach and lay in wait for me far up in the mountains. I moved again at full dark, slower now, thinking like him, reacting to every nuance of the land. My line of travel took me toward the distant craggy peaks, a mesa-like plateau that lay far ahead, ascended by intense starlight. That place would have been a good place to hide for an Apache scout, for it was out of context, easy to defend, and a place no one would expect someone to be hiding. Nails would probably be there, or at least I hoped he'd be there, for it would not be obvious choice for a tracker, and thus he would think it safe. Still, the nagging feeling that he knew of my approach persisted, but this was an approach so radical, I wondered if he would even consider it at all. After all, I had never taught it to him, for it relied far too much on inner vision, a deeper spiritual understanding, and I never believed he had those qualities outside of basic survival instinct. In my soul, I could feel this battle between us becoming one of instinct against spirit, a brutal battle at best. Before first light, I had reached the mesa area and found another little cave to hole up for the day. I was not yet ready to move during the day, for I had to be sure through the hard evidence of tracks that I was truly on his trail. After checking the cave for scorpions and snakes, which was especially difficult in the dark, I entered the cave to sleep. I had a very uneasy feeling when I laid my head down, for I somehow could feel his presence close by. I dismissed this feeling as a mirage born of extreme thirst, physical and mental exhaustion, and intense stress. I wandered in and out of sleep as the sun rose and began to pound the land once again. Sometime during these early morning hours, I opened my eyes and was shocked awake by a sight I could not believe. Inches from my hand were his tracks. I sat up abruptly, shaking with terror, for the track was only a few hours old. He had slept there only an hour before I arrived, and I have no idea why I didn't pick up his concentric rings. Somehow I had been driven to this place by a combination of knowledge, instinct, and spirit, or possibly it was just dumb luck. But I just didn't care. There would be plenty of time to figure it all out after this went over. I did not have time for the luxury of understanding it all right now. Nightmarish thoughts began to fill me. Certainly, I had missed the concentric rings of his position. But had he missed my approach? Did he abandon this cave because he knew I was coming? If he knew I was coming, then I was trapped inside the cave. I searched the ground desperately for answers. In moments, I found his exiting tracks and studied them. Any mistake with my analysis of these tracks would surely lead to my death. There was not a doubt in my mind that he might be waiting right outside. I hoped that because he had been in the cave, he might not have heard my approach, but I had to be sure, dead sure. The tracks revealed nothing outside of his normal intense caution, at least at the point where he exited the cave. He could have been part way around the mesa and still heard or felt me approach. I just didn't know. I had no choice but to follow his tracks one by one, reading every nuance, every action and reaction, until I could be dead certain that he did not know I was there. Following these tracks would put me well inside the danger zone, both for sniper fire and any traps that he might have set for now. I was back on the expected route of approach. Each track became an intense agony of analysis, but my confidence grew as the tracks told me he was looking back toward the direction that I might be taking across the valley, and not the radical new direction I had taken. I could not allow myself to be lured into a false sense of security. However, because the very next track could show signs that he knew I was there. I had not followed him more than a mile when I encountered another lethal trap. It was a carefully camouflaged trip that he had been set. One that would trigger a violent landslide of boulders above me. If I had missed it, I would have been wiped off the face of the mesa and crushed. I had to make the decision again to abandon the trail, for to remain there would only put me in more danger and slow my pace again. I agonized over the decision because I wanted to find out for sure if he knew I was on his trail, or if he only vaguely expected that I might be. Yes, to abandon the trail would make it safer and easier to travel again, but I would not know if he really knew or not. That tormented me because I wanted to know. I needed to know, and maybe I would never know. I just hate not knowing. Even in the best of circumstances, I could only take comfort in the fact that the decision was made for me by the presence of the trap. It was a tormented journey compounded by the hot sun, little sleep, intense thirst, and second-guessing his route of travel. The more I thought like he did, the more tortured I became. The darker my thoughts, at least I now had one thing in my favor for sure. It was obvious that up until this point, he had not detected my route of approach and had relied far too heavily on his traps to give me away. Though this gave me some relief, it was obvious from his choice of travel that he was good, really good, but not as good as I expected. As I look back now from this foggy agony of the gunshot wound, I realized that this had been my first deadly mistake. It gave me far too much confidence, which subsequently softened my judgment. Yet, as I think back further, my initial mistake was missing his concentric rings. As I approached the mesa cave in the first place, at the time of following him, that was more of a concern for me than underestimating his ability and overestimating mine. I gaze out upon the darkness of this concrete jungle and think back again in search of other mistakes I made, both before and after the Mesa Cave incident. The confidence had overtaken me and clouded my judgment as I began to move toward where I instinctively felt he would be hiding, or possibly waiting for me. I had been correct so far in this chess game, but I also knew that both of us were approaching a point of check or possibly a deadly checkmate. Instinct for a tracker goes well beyond a hunch. Instinct is driven by the forces of becoming what you are tracking and the spiritual reality of inner vision. It was this inner vision that was guiding me now, as it had before, and not the tracks. Knowing the tracks of Nails so well now and entering his movements and mind. I knew that this was one skill that he lacked. He did not know inner vision or the spiritual world. He was never interested in learning it or believing in it, and that could be a costly mistake. So many times I tried to teach the men I trained the skills of the spiritual world. Some would embrace it fully and learn its wonders. Others approached it at first with skepticism, but eventually came around. And few others blew it off altogether. Nails would never entertain even the thoughts of a spiritual reality, or even the more accessible world of the spirit that moves in and through all things. He would never try to exercise, and I knew that it shunned it and denied it from a place of fear. He knew that if there was such a place and it was real, then he could no longer justify his actions as a soldier of fortune or an assassin. His tracks thus far had not revealed any indication that he picked up any spiritual sensitivity other than to react to the concentric rings of the landscape. Yet I still could not make the assumption confidently. I knew from experience that when one's life is in danger, inner vision hammers through. In Nail's mind, his life was in danger. I followed my inner vision driven instinct far outside his last track and headed to a small ridge from a scout's point of view. The approach would be perfect. Not only was it in the open and in a very vulnerable position from the point of being seen, but it would be the unexpected approach. In the mind of Nails, he would not believe that anyone would be so stupid as to approach from the wide open. Yet I had taught him that the scout always does the unexpected, the impossible, but this route was too impossibly exposed. Before approaching the ridge, I further camouflaged my body with the dust and grit of the land, even though I had done the same camouflage ritual at the start of the track. I wanted to make damn sure that it was a perfect blend with the rocks and sands of the earth. Becoming invisible would be critical for this open and potentially lethal approach. Finally, as the shadows grew longer, I headed toward the distant ridge. These lengthening shadows were a blessing, for I reached the ridge far sooner than I expected. I moved within the context of the land, slipping from shadow to shadow, boulder to boulder, being careful not to rush or throw any concentric rings. Finally, as the light of day was waning, I reached the top of the ridge and stared down in a state of shock and astonishment. Far below me, nearly obscured by the deep shadow of another distant ridge in twilight, lay the ruins of some sort of town or factory. I could not make out exactly what it had been. From my vantage point, it appeared like some sort of bombed-out ruin. Abandoned and forgotten by man and eroded by time, it was stood out in stark contrast to the little valley it was nestled in. Another monument to man's cancerous vision of dominating nature. I lay there for a long time, trying to see into the ever-darkening landscape far below. My senses screamed for relief as I searched for any evidence, any concentric rings that Nails might have taken refuge there. It would have been a perfect place for him to hide. It afforded protection, survival, and a clear view of any approaching searchers. What was perfect for him was my worst nightmare. My element is the raw wilderness, and in any city or town, my tracking ability is greatly diminished. Even though this was the decaying remains of structures, it was still not pure wilderness. I faced the collision of two worlds, the epic struggle between man and nature, between Nails and me. Below me lay a balance of both worlds, and if Nails was a part of it, would be on equal ground. It was then that I caught the slight hint of concentric rings thrown by a mouse. It was so small, I might have not noticed it if it weren't watching, or if I weren't watching. It was unmistakable. Nails was there, hidden and waiting. I did not dare sleep. I had to use the full cover of night to get into the small town. The slope was so exposed that there would be no way I could approach during the day. My nerves were out their limits already, and I had to go now. As I worked my way down the slope, I took solace in the old saying, "On the plains of hesitation lay the blackened bones of countless millions who at the dawn of victory laid down the rest, and resting died." I had made the right decision. I could not rest or hesitate. Conditions were in my favor. The night was in my favor, and Nails would not be expecting me too soon. But my fatigue and deep thirst were a liability, and could obscure judgment and instinct. I did not know how rested Nails might be, for the hunted always has the advantage. The arduous journey down the slope was far more difficult than I had imagined or anticipated. It became a battle between moving carefully and reaching the refuge of the slope's bottom before first light. If I did not reach the boulder-strewn base by first light, Nails would see me. There was no way I could spend the day on the slope, for there was no place to hide from Nails or even the sun. I also had to take great care not to leave any tracks. Even a moderately trained tracker can see tracks leading down a gravel slope from great distances. Every step had to be carefully chosen and placed, more by feel than by sight. As the race between the two extremes of careful movement and approaching light intensified, I began to move more by inner vision, driven instinct in my mind and body. I was so fatigued that I had to fully trust this instinct. To do otherwise would mean failure and possibly death. I reached the rock-strewn base of the slope just in time. As I slipped into the refuge of this boulder field, the rising sun hit the slope I had just descended. Some of the boulders were as large as small cars, offering me many hiding spots, but my relief was quickly eroded as I looked back up the slope. A few of my tracks were obvious. Certainly I could see them, but could Nails? It's sometimes difficult to separate my ability from that of the people I've trained. I always assume that people can see what I see. Observe what I observe, and in a way, it's a blessing to overestimate. To me, a mouse track on a solid rock is easy to see, yet most trained trackers do not see them at all. I prayed that Nails would not see the disturbances of my tracks on the slope. After all, he had only been tracking for less than a decade. I was able to relax a little more when I saw a collared peccary disappear along the ridge. Surely anyone would make a mistake by few track disturbances as those of the peccary, I thought. I decided finally to rest and try to catch a quick nap, if I could. There was nothing much I could do about my intense thirst and hunger, though this boulder field afforded plenty of small, cool caves to get me out of the sun. There were no plants or even dried seeps where I might dig for water. I had not had water in a long time, and this deep dehydration would affect my body and mind in a negative way. As my body slowly consumed itself, mirages would be born and paranoia would become a reality. Now my struggle moved inward. I had to push through the mirages and nightmares of my mind and grope for reality. More than anything, I needed to call forth the animal within and become more action and reaction, more instinct than intellect. It would only be by letting go of myself fully that I could ever hope to stay alive. I could no longer think like a man, but had to react with the instincts of both man and animal. As I lay in my small, protected cave, I began to think of the struggles that were ahead. My concern shifted from finding nails to determining what to do once I found him. After all, he was armed, and I wasn't. He had time to rest along the way, and he was the cursed, hunted, and had the advantage. This was a misvision for me. It should have been then that I realized that I too must become the hunted as well as the hunter. After all, in a way, I too was being hunted. The hunter lay in wait for me. Like a deer, hunter sitting in a tree, stand waiting for the deer to pass by. I was deer, the hunted, but I didn't realize it at this moment. Clearly, this was a horribly lethal mistake. All I could think about was how would put nails at the disadvantage and get the gun or guns away from him. Then it would be one-on-one. He was a military-trained combatant and very lethal, and I was scout-trained, lethal too in the brutal aggression of Wolverine fighting. Normally, I would have the advantage, but now I was beyond exhaustion, and he was rested. It would be an equal battle if it came to that. I began to think desperately through all my options, all the skills I had learned from grandfather, along with those I had gleaned from life. I did not want, nor could I chance, a one-on-one fight with nails. I would have to get his guns and subdue him somehow. Possibly I could even trap him. Whatever I decided to do, it had to be done with all of the skill I possessed, all of my memory, training, and instinct. I had to have a plan before I reached the ruins, before the final moves of the game were to be played. But all of this depended on whether Nails was in fact still there. Possibly he had planned the same thing for me. He may have intentionally just passed through these ruins to lure me there, to set traps of his own, and to slow my progress. If he was still inside the ruins, which I now expected from the faint concentric rings, he would have to set traps for me. These traps, whether he was there or not, would be lightly camouflaged, precisely set, and deadly. I began to second guess whether I should go into the ruins at all, at least not until I was sure whether he was there or not. The prudent thing to do would be to circle the ruins and to see if he had gone on, or in fact if he had been there at all. If I did decide to cut track and found that he had gone on, I could follow him. Avoiding this tortured place altogether, I would also know if he was really outside, inside, or not. This way I would have to put up with any tracks or decrepit buildings. I would gain vast amounts of time. On the other hand, if I could confirm that he was there, I knew I would have to move with the utmost caution. But my instinct overruled these unconflicting thoughts. I knew deep inside that to hesitate would only give him the edge he needed, further depleting my strength and intensifying my thirst. I would be more prone to mistakes, for it would make me 2 full days to circle the ruins without seeing or being seen. I chose to follow my instincts in training, stop second-guessing myself, and go in. I had only a few moments of fitful sleep, but was able to rest up. I decided to move in at a high sun, doing the unexpected again. When most people would have remained hidden and moved only under the cover of night, but I was not like everyone else. The ancient scouts would have done the same, so would grandfather, or at least I thought. As I began to move, I wondered if Nails would expect me to come when the sun was high. It was the same as I had taught him to do. Under these circumstances, it would be the least expected move, with the training Nails had from me. He would expect me to move when the shadows lengthened, not at this time. At best, any move at any time was a gamble. The game played out in this arena was the grand struggle of flesh and spirit, hidden in this forgotten valley with only the eyes of mice, scorpions, and peccary to bear witness. I moved to a place near a cluster of boulders, taking care not to leave any tracks. I needed to look at the runes and determine what they were and their layout. I had to know or sense where Nails would be holed up. If he was there at all, I had to find more tracks, more evidence, and more concentric rings. Without giving away my presence, as I moved to the boulders, choosing my concealment carefully, I gazed toward the tormented structures that lay before me. This was not a town, but some sort of factory. There was a large, semi-demolished building at its center, and strewn all around this larger structure, seemingly at random, were many other fallen-down secondary buildings, many just rubble. Old semi-paved roadways like small city streets crisscrossed the rubble, disappearing and reappearing. Twisted, rusted, and decaying metal, old machinery, spent autos, and various bits of debris intermingled with the fallen mass of cement and rocks. It was a factory once, that was obvious, but what kind I did not know. I looked long and hard at the rubble, pressing my senses to the limits of endurance. As I was about to move from vantage point, I caught a movement. It was quick, nearly invisible, but it did send off faint concentric rings. I knew that Nails was inside. Only he or someone I had trained could have left such a small disturbance. My senses now rocketed to a higher level than before. Every nuance was scrutinized, vision intensified, colors enhanced, and even the sound of mice and scorpion feet were easily heard. I smelled and tasted the air to see if I could sense the lingering scent of him. Even my sense of touch made every nerve come alive, as if it electrified. I watched every flaw and disturbance in the landscape, every bent blade of brown grass, every pebble that lay out of context within this rubble that itself lay out of context with the land. I knew where Nails had gone in, and now I was damn sure that he was still there. My heart raced, for the confrontation was close, and now every movement, every second had to be calculated. I knew now why he chose this place, but it would not have been my choice. This was what was familiar to him. The rusted metal and broken down structures afforded him a grand survival potential for a skill level. It was easy to defend and no doubt easy to find water. There had to be an abandoned well somewhere nearby. I would have chosen to go to the craggy rocks and caves far up the ridge line, and there I would have been at home, just as the ancient scouts had been, and just as grandfather had taught me to be so many years ago. Rugged and pure wilderness, to me, to grandfather, and to the ancient scouts, is always a refuge, a place called home. It is wilderness that keeps us safe and free. where we can roam outside the worlds of man. Nails had chosen something close to his world, his home, but my home was encroaching upon it. Right now there was a balance between the two forces, but soon it would be won back by the forces of creation. It became for me the razor's edge upon which I must balance, being able to see my world and his world at the same time. I began to move like a gentle breeze that disturbs not a blade of grass. I clung close to the larger boulders, becoming their shadow, taking care not to unsettle even an ant. It was not long before I reached the uttermost fringe of the rubble. I had chosen the most open route I could find. I knew that Nails would be looking in the more obvious places for any approach. I began to study the landscape and the ground at greater distances, trying to find his tracks long before I would come upon them. This would give me an early warning of his movement up until now and alert me to any traps he might have set. I learned long ago that a tracker has to see tracks from great distances, especially when tracking a fugitive. Early warning, even when tracking a lost person or animal, is critical to awareness and safety. I also had to be extremely careful to leave no tracks, at least no tracks that he could see. And I had to remain invisible, just in case he happened by me. Finally, I found his track not far from where I lay, and a great sense of relief washed over me. He had arrived there only a few hours before me, and that would not have given him enough time to set any traps. If any, he was probably still carefully exploring his new home, and given the nuances of his tracks, he did not seem very concerned about anyone following him. But his tracks did indicate that he was concerned about the abandoned buildings, as he should have been, as he had been trained to be. Upon his initial approach, he would not even know if any unoccupied or if anyone occupied any of the buildings. His attention would have been diverted away from what lay behind him and turned toward what lay ahead of him. It should have been both. Grandfather had taught me, as I had taught Nails, that attention should be all around, not just ahead or behind, but all around. Nails had broken a simple rule. Now I was breaking the same rule, ruddily awakened by the fact that a rattlesnake just rattled at me not far from my side. I lay still, frozen in time, slipping into the sacred silence of the soul in a place of splendid non-existence that creates a state of invisibility to all that passes by. The snake slowly slipped by just a few inches from my hand and into the cover of a crevice. As he disappeared out of sight, I began to go into the state of panic. The rattle, I thought, even though short and quiet, did it throw the kind of concentric rings that Nails would pick up? I couldn't chance it. I had to get out of this position, and the only escape lay within the confines of the rubble ahead of me. Going there would take me into Nails' home, but I had no choice. If he did hear the snake, he would come to investigate. Not only did I have to escape and find cover, but I had to become more careful than ever before not to leave any tracks he could find. As I moved, I fought the adrenaline rush, for to give in to it would cause even more disturbances, more concentric rings, and more tracks. It was so difficult to fight against the primal fight or flight instinct that drives us all. The ancient scouts were trained to move out of that state, and to do the unexpected, the impossible. I found refuge in the rubble almost immediately, with little effort. No doubt the creator and spirits of the scouts were with me, because it was the only place I could have gone. Any other choice would have to put me in the open. I had held my position for a long time, waiting, watching, and intently scrutinizing every nuance of this strange landscape. I had to be sure that Nails had not heard the rattle. The sheer intensity of the waiting and watching began to take its toll on my senses. I could feel the thirst, the aches, the pounding fatigue, and I had to struggle not to retire within myself, for that would be the place of mirage, a coffin of flesh cut off from what is real and dangerous. I fought to stay alert and ready, like a hunted coyote, just in case I missed something while making my initial escape. I had to pay attention to everything around me, too. for I could not chance disturbing another animal, no matter how small and insignificant its concentric rings. I had to move outside the realm of even the smallest of creatures, a task that is not easy to do even at the best of times. Moments had turned into what seemed like hours, but the sun had not moved that far across the sky. I pressed my senses far outside their limits, not only focusing on my movement within the ruins, but well behind or beyond. I could not chance the assumption that Nails was still inside the rubble, for he might be foraging for survival in the surrounding mountains now. It would be a horrible mistake to make my move if he was in fact at higher elevation outside the area. From a higher vantage point, he could clearly see anyone entering the factory area, no matter how well camouflaged. Any concentric rings thrown from the rubble would intensify as they traveled up the face of the mountains. I first focused on all the areas that he might be moving or hiding. I don't think I can finish it. No. Alright, I gotta finish it tomorrow, I guess. Let me shut it off. Hour and a half, Jesus Christ. Pain in the fucking ass. Alright, let me shut it off. Alright, I'm gonna try to pick up, I guess, where I left off. In and then refocus my attention on all the areas he would never use. It was there, in a totally unexpected area, that I picked up a very faint sign of his presence. It was nothing more than a small pile of rocks and broken cement near a crevice of a fallen building, but it marked his first camp. The little pile of rocks was built especially to obscure the small opening of the little hide, so that no one approaching would know it was there. I knew that this would have been my choice if I were in his place. It was in such a position that no one could easily find it, much less think that anyone could hide there. From its vantage point, Nails could easily see all approaches from the surrounding area as well as the rubble compound itself. Though I couldn't confirm much more, I had to assume that there were several escape routes throughout the little cave and building system. It would be difficult, if not impossible, approach. I had to find a route that would take me closer without exposing me to surrounding mountains or the artificial cave itself. I also could not afford to wait much longer. The shadows were lengthening, and that would put Nails on higher alert, for that would be the time he would expect me to move. I had to keep doing the unexpected, moving through the impossible and doing the improbable. I began to inch forward, flowing through the deepest recesses of the rubble and taking extreme care not to peer over the top of anything. Several times I had to come to an abrupt, nearly panic-stricken stop as faint concentric rings of nature would erupt from the rubble around me or the mountains above. At these times, I had to define the maker of each disturbance before I moved on. Some of these disturbances were hard to define because they were so far in the distance. There was no disturbance in particular that I could not fully define. I knew that it was a predator or several predators together, like hunting coyotes or dogs, yet it could also have been the kind of disturbance made by man. Whatever it was, it had a lethal effect on the land and in the core of my very soul. The only good thing about it was that it originated from far up in the mountains, and if it was Nails, there would be no way he could see me moving forward his suspected encampment. Nearing the opening of the small cavern, I decided to go to the extreme instead of staying within the deep crevices of the rubble. I decided to take the most open and exposed route I could find. Again, considering what Nails would expect, it would be totally unexpected and probably overlooked. As I neared the vast open area, I spotted several more tracks belonging to Nails. From his route along the outskirts of the area, I could see he was using the same deceptive techniques I had taught him, but not at the level of the extreme approach I was using. There was no doubt that he chose this route to keep the moderate cover while inspecting the fallen buildings and rubble. Several times along the way, I found his tracks looking back from where he had come, and a few times he paused and hid for a few moments. It wasn't that he was hiding from anything, or anyone in particular, but hiding so that he could watch and listen before moving on and into the little cave that lay not far ahead. I could see and feel part of myself moving within his tracks. After all, it was my training that was now guiding his movements, and thus he became part of me, as I had to become part of him. It was so difficult to see my part of myself in the tracks of this killer, but it was a relief to see him moving in this way too, because he was not really moving the way I would give, or have given him. The same circumstances, I would have taken a more obscure route, taking greater care to cover my tracks, especially during that time of night he had moved. So, too, would I have taken the route I was now taking. He had chosen to take a route that would throw off most searchers and hunters, but not me. I didn't know if he had done this to make me think he did not expect me to be following him, or if he did it to give me a false sense of security. As usual, these questions burned in my mind, making decisions difficult. If he didn't expect me and the tracks were intentional, then he might be luring me into a trap. I could not chance letting down my guard and underestimating his ability. I decided then I would assume the worst, without any doubt that he had set me up by deliberately setting down this type of trail and route of approach. Grandfather so often told me that the scout always assumes the worst-case scenario, never giving in to what he thinks is an easy or safe situation. Otherwise, it would be far too easy to underestimate the hunted, especially if the hunted had nearly the same level of skill as the hunter. By making this decision, the going would be slow but safer. I knew that I had given Nails only a small % of my skill and knowledge, but I could not know how much he had learned on his own. Experience is the best teacher. He had a vast experience as a warrior and assassin. Yet it is not enough to assume the worst, nor enough for me to become Nails. For now, I had to hunt him, as if I were really hunting myself. Even then, I felt this was not a good idea, was not good enough, or something inside me demanded more. I had to hunt him at an even higher level than I hunt myself. For once a decision was made that could lead to life or death, I had to hunt him as if I were actually hunting Grandfather. As I approached the edge of the open area, I watched both the surrounding mountains and the fallen structures very carefully. Every sense now had to be on the highest level of alert, well beyond the physical awareness that most people would consider normal. I had to pay rapt attention to every detail. Even the faintest and farthest concentric rings had to be analyzed. Even the smallest and the most insignificant noughts of nature, missed or misread, could mean death. I also had to find a route across the barren field that would not allow easy detection, but would afford me the best possible scenario for counter-tracking. What made the journey worse was that I had to do it quickly, before the shadows grew longer. Moving too fast, however, could be as deadly as moving too slowly. It had to be a balance between the two extremes, decided more by experience and instinct than rational thought. Any thinking at this time would be a costly mistake as far as I was concerned. The journey across the open area seemed like it took the eternity to complete. The area was so open that for most of the trip I had to rely on my camouflage completely. I had to trust fully my ability to become invisible, not only to Nails, but also to any animal that might frighten, thus sending vast concentric rings rippling across the valley that would be picked up by Nails. I had to force myself to stop thinking that Nails was up in the surrounding mountains too. There was an equal chance that the unknown disturbance I had failed to identify may or may not have been thrown by Nails. I didn't want to lean one way or another, at least not until the tracks told me which way to believe. I don't know if it was dumb luck or spiritual intervention, but by the exact time I reached the cover of the far side of the field, two things happened. Another ring came thundering down off the mountain, thrown up by a running deer, and definitely caused by man. For no other predator would send a deer fleeing this way. At the exact moment of the disturbance, I found the freshest set of tracks belonging to Nails. The tracks led up the mountain. The concentric rings had originated from near the midway point up the mountain slope, and given the identity and age of the tracks, it had to be Nails who set off those concentric rings. I also knew now that Nails must be on full alert. Sending out concentric rings of that magnitude is a huge blunder, whether you are hunted or hunter, and now Nails was left to intensify his level of awareness. And given his heightened state of awareness, it made movement for me much more difficult. So too, I had to wonder if the deer might have been intentionally sent to flight as a diversion for me. Nails could have planted a non-lethal trap up on the slope on the deer trail that would have frightened the deer in this manner, leading me to mistakenly assume he was at mid-slope. He could now very easily have been lying in waiting somewhere in the rubble after all. I would have used the same tactic if I were being hunted by him. Now movement and tracking no longer became an issue, for I was frozen in time and place, unable to make any decision. I had to do now what Nails was probably doing. Whether he intentionally threw the concentric rings or blundered into the deer accidentally, had to wait and wait at the highest level of awareness. To do anything else at this point would be a deadly mistake. Now it had become a waiting game, a game to see who would move first, and the first to move would give his position to the other. The only thing I had going for me was that Nails would not be sure where I was hiding, if he even suspected that I was in the area at all. However, I could assume nothing, for the concentric rings could also have been caused by a large predator like a mountain lion. The concentric rings thrown by a mountain lion and a man are distinctly different. Yet at that great distance and far up the slope, I could have misinterpreted their origins. There was also the outside chance that another man had thrown the deer into the panic. Though there were no signs or tracks to back this theory up, I could not rule it out entirely. After all, several times during the past few days, a helicopter had passed far overhead. The third man issue began to haunt me as I waited motionless in the shadows of the rubble. The deer had definitely been sent into a panicked flight by either a man or a mountain lion. Yet, if it was a man and a possible third man that came on the scene, given the nuances of the concentric rings of the running deer, the third man had to be good in the wilderness. I began to be haunted by the distinct possibility that the helicopter that had passed me several times over the past few days may have something to do with this third man theory. I'd assumed that the helicopter had been too high to see me, but if they were in fact looking for me, they might have picked up my location after all. In the past, I had trained many military helicopter pilots to track from the air, and this might be one of them, now come back to haunt me. This would explain the third man, and the third man could be a sniper, sent to assist me covertly to make sure Nails was taken out. Now the situation was growing very complicated. If there was a third man in the deadly game, and he was a sniper, which I was growing closer to believing, then all the rules had changed. Surely Nails would also have picked it all up. Questions bordering on paranoia began to flood my mind. Was there a sniper dropped over the ridge by the helicopter? Was Nails aware of me there as well as the sniper, or is he totally unaware of anything at all? Was the sniper, if there was one at all, there to protect me, or did he just want to take Nails in dead or alive? And if I died in this deadly mix, would I become nothing more than collateral damage to everyone concerned? After all, for the past few years, I had not been on the best of terms with the government men. I had been trained and training. I didn't like teaching grandfather skills to make people more efficient killers, and I let them know it, backing away from the teaching process as much as possible. I was frozen in a state of mental paralysis. Fortunately, I realized that was going on within me. The extreme fatigue, dehydration, and the relentless cat-and-mouse game with Nails, and the possibility of death had caused me to second-guess myself. It is essential, on the edge of physical and mental extremes, that a tracker keep cool and objective. Irrational thinking could be deadly, and assuming that misread concentric rings could in fact be a sniper was a stretch of the imagination, more hallucination than reality. Though I could not fully dismiss this third man theory completely, I had to set it aside and make it only a distant possibility. I could not allow the distraction of another person in the mix to detract from my focus on tracking Nails. Splitting my attention, especially where Nails was concerned, could be a deadly mistake. No doubt, if there was a third man and even he was a sniper, I would probably not be the target. After all, it was Nails that they wanted, not me. However, I could afford to blow this theory off completely, only to keep its possibility in the back of my mind. To ignore it altogether would be a mistake. A scout always assumes the worst. I refocused my attention on the tracks that lay before me. At least I could study them and determine what time Nails had headed up the face of the mountain. Without being seen, this would break the monotony of the intense waiting and help clear my mind. All the time resting before I headed up the slope, from the cover of this place, I would be able to hear my movement up on the slope. These tracks were also a gift because they clung close to cover and I could follow them quite a way without revealing my position. I just had to be careful, and my attention stayed split between reading Nails' tracks, remaining hidden, and listening intently for any subsequent movement. Unfortunately, as I followed the tracks. I began to get sucked into them. The tracks indicated that Nails was doing something odd. Though I could not read them easily, the pressure releases had been partially erased, and it was like reading text with every other word missing. It demanded my full attention, but I had no idea what the tracks were really telling me. The one major flaw Grandfather was always trying to correct in me as a tracker was the way I would get sucked into reading a track. It wasn't so much the reading, but the way I would block out everything else outside of the track. So many times I would be tracking a deer and not notice at the point of reading the track another deer was passing by in front of me. This always gave Grandfather a good laugh, for I would miss so much of what was going on around me. He was constantly telling, "Vary your vision, grandson, vary your vision." That was one of my major downfalls as a tracker for a good tracker, is paying attention not only to the track, but the universe around him. It got so bad that as I tracked Grandfather, I would pass right by him, following his tracks, only to be kicked in the ass by him, standing just inches from the track I was gazing upon. As I grew older, Grandfather no longer found this habit amusing. He would often tell me that such a mistake, such focused absorption, could cost my life or the life of another. I thought that I had outgrown this bad habit. The events that followed are now only a blur, an instant in time and reaction, but a heartbeat from eternity. As I crouched over one of Nail's tracks, trying to read what he was telling me, a chain of events occurred, almost at once. It was not the knowledge of what the track was telling me that I could have articulated at the time, but rather the instinctual reaction to it. If I had remained crouched over the track, the bullet would have hit me in the back of the head. If I had just stood, the bullet would have hit me in the center of my back and crippled me from the waist down. But in blinding reaction, I stood and turned hard to my right. It was that exact moment of realization of what the track was telling me that I reacted like a striking rattlesnake. At that moment, I realized that the track was telling me that Nails knew that I was tracking him, and I clearly heard Grandfather's voice demand, "Vary your vision," at the same time. I also knew that he was behind me and that the situation was lethal. I just reacted without thought and with every ounce of fear, rage, and power I had within me. I remember feeling the bullet hit me, but not hard. It was more a burning pain than anything else and not debilitating. But it unleashed the animal within me. My life was in danger, and all I could do was react with violence, more violence than I have ever known. I hit Nails hard, so hard that I could feel the bones breaking in my hands. As I connected with his face, he went down in a cloud of dust, and I crumpled beside him. Thoughts swirled by my mind. I was spent. I exploded with the last energy I had and survived. I was so angry at myself for making such a stupid mistake, a mistake I had made over and over again. I should have known immediately that the tracks were telling me that Nails knew I was on his trail. I should have known that they were laid down by Nails to divert my attention, forcing me to think he was far up the slope. I was humiliated because Nails had beaten me. Being beaten by one of my students was more than I could bear. Worse yet was being beaten by myself, and a stupid mistake that would have cost me my life. The winds of the approaching storm began to kick up dust, and the sky blackened. Soon it would be raining, and I thought about dragging Nails to the cover of a small recess in a nearby building. I wondered when he knew that I was tracking him. None of the tracks up until this point had indicated that he knew anything at all. It was only these tracks that showed any indication that he knew that I was tracking him. I wondered when I made my mistake, then when I was seen, or if the tracks were just laid down out of Nail's paranoia, where he only assumed that I was tracking him. Whatever the reason and purpose, he was laying in wait for me, and I had passed right by him, just as I passed by Grandfather so many times before, only this time I was not kicked in the ass, but shot in the back. There was no doubt in my mind that I would not make the mistake again, for it will forever be etched in my very soul. Nails still hadn't moved, and I began to fear that he was badly hurt, or worse. I began to crawl closer to him now. Thoroughly enraged at myself for that damn mistake, I had been hoping to find him asleep and capture him after removing his gun or guns. But now all that changed. Because of my incompetence, both of us were hurt and out in the middle of the desert. I knew that it would take several days to get us out of there, and given the extent of the injuries, it would become a life-or-death struggle. Even in the best of shape, crossing the desert and relying only on survival skills would be difficult. The only consolation, I thought, was that the oncoming storm would at least provide us some much-needed water. I began to pray and pray hard, for my body and mind were spent, and I had hardly enough energy to sit up. It was a struggle just to roll from lying on the ground to the sitting position, but at least the pain of the gunshot wound had diminished, and the bleeding had stopped. As I eventually came to a painful sitting position, I gasped in amazement. Not 100 yards away, I saw a man approaching. He was wearing some sort of camouflaged uniform and carrying a high-powered rifle. He carried the rifle with its muzzle up, indicating that he was not about to shoot, neither was he concerned that we were any threat. I could feel my face burn with the rush of angry blood, for I had made another mistake. I had discounted another presence, the third man, and here he stood in bold reality. I was humiliated again, knowing damn full well that I had second-guessed my second guessing and had nearly written off all of the concentric rings. It was obvious now that the helicopter had spotted me, and he was there to track me, tracking Nails. I should have known. I had only tried to hunt and stalk Nails, never realizing that I was being set up and followed. I should have also disappeared altogether. That third man could have been a liability by alerting Nails earlier in the struggle. I wonder if, in fact, he was the reason Nails had known that I was following him. After all, Nails would know how these folks operate. As this man walked toward us, I felt a strange kinship with Nails. It was almost a feeling that I was somehow on his side, in a macabre sort of way. After all, it was he and I who played this deadly game of hunter and hunted. It was I who had trained Nails, and in a way I was responsible for him. It was we who survived this desert and all of its hardships, and not this outsider, this third party with the rifle. Anger burned within me as I watched the man's approach. I connected him to all the things that had gone wrong, the circumstances that had created and driven Nails to do what he had done. That man just spoke volumes of what was wrong, and the way people are used up and then thrown away. For a brief moment, as he drew nearer, I thought about taking him out and letting Nails go. But at the same time, I realized that this was coming from a place of anger, fatigue, and my failure as a tracker. All I could think about was how embarrassing this would have been for Grandfather. The man walked up to us and surveyed the situation for a long moment. I could not even speak, for it had been days since I had uttered a word, and I was also afraid of what I might say. He first glanced at Nails with a look of disgust and loathing, and then at me. I could see from a makeshift sort of uniform that he was not from any military outfit I knew, though he was carrying a U.S.-made .308 caliber sniper's rifle. After a long and thoughtful pause, he said in a very broken English, "Mr. Brown, I have come to take possession of your prisoner." His voice was very formal, yet ironically very passionate toward me, which stunned me for a moment. I tried to question him, but nothing would come out. My throat felt parched and welded shut. My brain could not fathom what he was saying, and I could not connect any words to my thoughts. Without waiting for me to answer, he said, "Mr. Frank has asked me to retrieve you and the prisoner and bring you both back to our compound." With that, he spoke into his radio. In a few minutes, a pickup truck came up the rutted road. As I painfully got into the front seat of the pickup truck, too tired to argue the circumstances, I watched as two other men dressed the same way as the sniper loaded Nails into the canvas-covered back part of the pickup bed. He was placed on an old Korean War-era stretcher, but loaded as if he were just a pile of garbage. I tried to protest his treatment, but could not muster the energy. As we drove away, I looked through the back window of the truck, through a rent in the curtain, and saw that they were not doing anything for Nails to help him. The guard just sat there and talked. I, on the other hand, sipped fresh water and tried to relax for a long ride out. I had enough to do to fight fatigue, the nagging pain in my back, and to try to figure out where we were, all the while desperately piecing together all the events of the past several days. What haunted me the most was reliving all of the horrible mistakes I had made, not to mention the biggest mistake of all, that of teaching people like nails in the first place, someplace in the middle of nowhere along this rutted excuse for a road, I gave into a much-needed and very profound sleep. Next thing I knew, I was abruptly wakened by the truck pulling into an old compound of sorts. It was some sort of official-looking building, still in the middle of the desert, and with a small town built up around it. As I was ushered quickly into the building, I noticed the Suburban I had ridden in a few days before, but Frank was nowhere to be found. I glanced down the driveway and spotted his tracks along with the tracks of several other individuals like him. I was taken into a dank and dusty doctor's office that looked more like a backwoods veterinary clinic and sat on an old table covered by an equally old mattress and worn sheet. There I met a frail old man in a dingy white lab coat, sporting an ancient stethoscope, and I immediately assumed he was some sort of doctor. Applied to him, the word doctor was a stretch, for his hands looked like they hadn't been washed since he plowed the backfield. Yet when he spoke, though in broken English, he sounded both compassionate and knowledgeable, which alleviated any fears I had. Reluctantly, I allowed him to look at my back, but he seemed to be rather unconcerned about the wound. Apparently, it felt worse than it actually was. He jabbered about how lucky I was that it was only a graze, even though the bullet had passed into my back. It only threaded its way under the skin and out again like a splinter. He told me that he was not going to stitch it up, but would leave both the entrance and exit wounds open so that they would drain out of any infection. At least the bandages he applied were sterile, but the syringe he used to inject the penicillin was a little suspect. I thought it looked like the last time it had been used was to inoculate livestock. At least now, given the water and sleep and the bandaged wound, I began to feel better. Questions began to surface, and I asked the doctor now, how is Nails doing? He grew very quiet and simply told me that he would find out. With that, he jumped up and abruptly left the room. I did not like the way he reacted to my question and began pacing impatiently as I awaited his return, which seemed to take forever. Finally, after what seemed to be a better part of an hour, another man came in wearing the same strange military uniform as the gunman. In far better English, he told me that my prisoner had been turned over to Mr. Frank and that my services would no longer be required. I pounded him with questions, but wouldn't get no answers. He kept saying that my prisoner had been turned over to Frank and the proper authorities. The more questions I asked about the situation, the more evasive the man became with his answers. I grew very angry and exasperated, for it was apparent that someone was trying to cover up something, and that was pissing me off. It infuriated me that I did all the dirty work and put my life on the line and then was cast aside like an old rag. Your services are no longer required. What a crock of crap. Yet it should not have surprised me, for this same thing has happened so many times before, and each time I allow myself to get angry and upset over the evasiveness. After another hour of waiting, I was rushed out of the building and into another pickup truck. The driver spoke no English at all, and the two men that rode in the back bed were not the same ones that rode with me back from the desert. It was obvious that the doorway to answers had effectively slammed shut, and I was on my way someplace in a hurry. As we drove, I could see a large town for ahead, and it was obvious that we were going there. At this point, I was expecting to eventually be put up in some motel and then be debriefed by Frank. But to my surprise, that did not happen. Instead, they took me directly to a small airstrip and a small twin-engine airplane. Given the scant markings of the plane, I could not tell the country of origin or even if it could fly. It looked so old and weather-beaten, I could no longer tell what color it had been painted. Originally, even the seats were frayed and worn. As I was rushed into the passenger seat, I realized that they wanted me out of there as quickly as possible. I tried to protest, but was met with blank stares. I was livid with the rushed treatment, even though my escort tried to remain pleasant and cordial. The angrier I became, the more official they tried to become. I was so pissed off that no one was telling me anything. I even made the comment that I was going to go home and go directly to the New York Times with my story. But they didn't seem to care. For the matter, I wasn't even sure they understood anything I was saying. Within moments, We were rolling down the runway, my escort making damn sure that I took off. It also became obvious that the pilot did not speak English either, so I didn't bother to ask him any questions. In fact, the pilot wore an expression that said he did not want to be bothered at all, and he did not speak a word throughout the whole flight. Eventually, after hours of flying over ever-changing landscapes, we landed at a major airport where I was immediately ushered onto another plane, this time a jet, but with no markings other than required numbers. To my amazement, this new plane was nearly empty except for a handful of official-looking people. As I grabbed some water and a sandwich at the galley and made my way to my seat, I was met by a man who was dressed the same way as Frank. He smiled at me warmly and said, "Thank you, Tom," before I could get a word out. He continued saying, "You are well aware of the routine. There is no debriefing. Just go back to your life. The fewer questions you ask, the better. And once again, thank you." With that, he turned and walked off the plane, giving only an obligatory, I don't know what the fuck this word is. Obligatory wave as he left immediately. I don't know what the fuck they're saying there. Okay. An obligatory wave as he left. Immediately, the door was closed, and almost as quickly, we were underway. I was enraged, to say the very least. I was angry at the system, angry at being kept in the dark, and angry over what I just lived through. Most of all, I was angry at myself and all the mistakes I had made, mistakes that could have cost me my life. What bothered me most is what happened to Nails, and that they rushed me off so fast without so much as a debriefing. Something was wrong with this whole mess. I wanted answers desperately, but I knew from past experience there would be none. I felt much like Nails in a way. I'd been used and then abandoned when I was no longer needed. I wondered how many operations and missions he found himself on that were so clouded by questions. I wondered if he ever knew that he was being used, only to be abandoned and denied, eventually only to be hunted down like a rabid animal. It troubled me that I did not know where he was, how badly he was injured, or if they might just have killed him outright. Thus, avoiding any courts, the most haunting and disturbing factor of it all was the sickening feeling that I might not have just injured or maimed Nails, but might have actually killed him. That I may never know even what few friends he had not heard from since the murders occurred. Now, not only will I have to live with the ghost of Nails, but with all the horrible mistakes I made when I tracked him. Not knowing is one of the greatest tracking mysteries I will face for the rest of my life. Someday, somehow, like all trackers, I will find answers. Oh, that was a pain in the fucking ass. Now, that's the true story behind the movie The Hunted. That's the actual real story. There's a couple of typos though. It kind of sounds retarded. So whatever. All right. This is by Tom Brown Jr. Case Files of the Tracker, and it's called My Frankenstein. So this is the real story behind the movie The Hunted with Benicio del Toro and Tommy Lee Jones. The reading wasn't that good, but whatever. It's the best I could do. It took me 2 hours.